Kotlow from the Holocaust Survivors and Friends Education Center in Latham, New York. I am in the studio of Capital Cablevision in Albany, New York, to interview Serge Patentreger. With me in the studio are director Henry Scoburn, producer Mary Alice Mogart from the College of St. Rose, and production assistants Ken Michaud and Lauren Fisher. Welcome. Please tell us your name, your birth name, the date of your birth, and the city and country in which you were born.
My name is Serge Patentreger. I was born on June 9, 1939, in Paris, France.
Describe your family life before the war.
Well, I don't know all that much about the details of family life before the war, but obviously I was not born. I was born just before the war. But I know that my family, which consists of my father and my mother, came from Poland in the late 20s. My father already had 2 daughters from a previous marriage in Poland. His first wife had died, and he decided to marry my mother, who happened to be his first wife's niece. So they came to France through Belgium. That time, that was back in the 20s, there was a lot of migration from Eastern Europe into France, particularly into Western Europe, but France particularly. And when they came into Belgium and then France, it was mostly for economic reasons. That was the reason for the big migration. A lot of people went to Europe, Western Europe, a lot of people went to America. They decided to come to France. They were married in Valenciennes, which is a city in northern France, I don't remember the year, 1929, I believe. And they moved then into Paris in 1930. There was one child who was born shortly after marriage, but also died shortly after birth. That was the first one, so we never knew her. My sister Jacqueline was born in 1931. Then my brother Charles was born in 1933. My twin brothers, twin brother and sister, Henry and Adela, were born in 1936. And I was born in 1939. So before the war, there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of us, my mother and father, plus the 2 daughters from a previous marriage, Rose and Anne, who at that time were teenagers in the late 30s. So before the war, there were, can't figure out how many that is, living in an apartment in Paris, Rue Maurice Bouchet, 6 Rue Maurice Bouchet. I was born in the Rothschild Hospital in the, what we call 20th arrondissement in Paris, and divided into 20 parts. And we lived in the 14th arrondissement, which was a working class section, working class neighborhood. My father was an itinerant merchant. My mother did not really have a career or a profession, or not even a job. What she did was odd jobs, where she was employed either as a seamstress, whatever she could get. Right? And obviously, it was not a very prosperous family at all. And not only that, but my mother and father were not born in France. Obviously, had a great deal of difficulty, at least I understand from my older sisters and brothers, with the French language. Difficulty in finding employment, difficulty in all sorts of things. But they became naturalized citizens, which gave them a lot of pride. I know that my mother always talked about becoming a French citizen. So that was essentially the situation before the war. As I said, I was born June 9, which was only 3 months before the war actually started. So I remember absolutely nothing of before the war. All I'm telling you is based on what I heard and learned from my brothers, my sisters, and my mother, and friends. Well, a lot of friends. My mother had an amazing number of friends in Paris. She was a very resourceful woman, a very outgoing woman, probably just the opposite of my father, actually, from what I understand, who was really more reserved and intellectual and probably sort of unhappy with his fate that he had found in France, but at least was a living, they say. and he did manage to keep the family together. So the family was kept together. And as I understand from both my older sister and older brother, things were going at least reasonably well. Even though there were many kids, we were not very well off by any means, but things were going well. That's about it. And my two sisters, my two half-sisters, I should say, Rose and Anne, were also, one of them was working, the other one was a student. So at least it helped the family out. Yeah.
What happened when Hitler came to power? Do you remember? And the year, please? And
well, as I said before, I was born with the war. I consider myself a war child, somebody who was conditioned by the war. So I can't say that's all first-hand knowledge, obviously, but I know that what I'm going to tell you is the truth because of all the things I've heard from my brothers, my sisters, my mother, and friends, again, who probably went through the same tribulations as my whole family. War broke out in September '39. As I said, we're all in Paris together. The first few months of the war were really nothing at all. It was not, in fact, they called it the funny war, the drôle de guerre. It was nothing until really May of 1940. May 1940, the war actually broke out. That's when Hitler and the German army invaded through Belgium and came into northern France, and after that it was very, very quickly over. In 1.5 months or 2 months, it was over. By June of 1940, the war was practically won by the Germans. What happened, and affected us personally, is that in June 1940, or I don't remember exactly the dates, I was 1 year old. All of Paris, or at least most of Paris, fled because of the advancing German army. Everybody knew that once they came here, they would probably suffer the same fate as people of Warsaw, the people of Belgium, and so on. And everybody had been warned, especially the women, children, and older people fled Paris. That was known as the Great Exodus out of Paris. There was something I've read someplace, there was something like 2 million people left Paris in a space of a few weeks. And we left, but you have to remember that the situation was so chaotic, so terrible when the word came to leave Paris, especially in our case where we didn't have anywhere to go. There were many, many people in France who did have a place to go to. France is, especially Paris, big cities, are mainly people who've come from somewhere else. They all had somewhere to go. In fact, that's one of the things that they've always said about Jews in France and probably other countries, that they had nowhere else to go. They were always in one place but nowhere else to go. Anyway, many French people did have a place to go, usually the country. In those days, everyone had a relative someplace in the country. And those who didn't had to flee and hope that they'll find someplace. So in, I believe it was in June 1940, we left, the whole family left from Gare Montparnasse in Paris, which was one of the main train stations, in, I'm sure, utter chaos and disorder and confusion. 2 million people were left within a span of a few weeks. And where we were going was strictly west. Didn't know where we were going to wind up.
was your father also with you?
Our father was still with us at that point, yes. We all left together, at least as I understand it, the first time. We went west, but I'm not sure how long my father stayed with us. So I can tell you about my mother and my brothers and sisters. I do not remember anything about my father, nothing at all. So I know that I'd never seen him where we eventually wound up. When we left Paris, we took the first train, whatever train was going west. Everybody was going either west or southwest or southeast. But those were the areas that were still not touched by the war, and we felt a little safer, or people felt a little safer over there. Anyway, we took the train, which was, Gare Montparnasse was not far from where we were living, so it was the easiest place to go to anyway. And as my mother described it, took the first train with whatever she could gather. And let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 kids. So it's 2 adults and 7 kids. And just packed into that train. Everybody packed in there and just went. Well, what happened after that is the train, of course, stopped along the way. And the question was how far you went and to look for something. As I mentioned before, my mother was extremely resourceful. So I'm sure she had in mind to go as far away from Paris as possible and manage. We did wind up in a place in Brittany called Chateaubriant, which was the actual last stop for the train. My mother somehow, as soon as she got out of the station, managed to meet some people who introduced her to the mayor of the town over there. And she was able to, and I'm making a very long story short, she was able to secure at least a place to sleep for the night or next couple of nights for all of us. But we were not all together. There were some that happened to be in with the mayor's house, actually. Some others who went somewhere else. I'm not sure where we went, but I know we were not together.
Do you know if the mayor knew your family was Jewish?
At that point, I really don't know, and I don't think it mattered at that point, because then everybody was fleeing Paris. As I said before, there were most people who were not Jewish had a place to go, all right? But there were a lot of people who were not Jewish who also had no place to go. So you didn't know at that point. There was such chaos and confusion that you could be anybody and was just looking for a place to escape the war for a few days, a few months, whatever. So the mayor did manage to take us in Chateaubriant. But eventually, of course, we had to find other accommodation. And I believe that's when my father, I don't know exactly all the events, but I know my father eventually went back to Paris once things calmed down. And we, meaning at least my mother and some of us, my father did take his 2 daughters back to Paris. I know that, because they were never with us after that. And we wound up my mother started looking for a place for us, and based on the recommendation by the help of the mayor, wound up in a place called St Vincent, which was a small village, something like maybe 10 kilometers further west from Chateaubriant. As I said before, Chateaubriant was the last stop on the train. The train didn't go any further, so you couldn't. So I'm not sure how we wound up in St Vincent. All I know is that we were taken in by a French couple, Monsieur and Madame Bouchet. That's B-O-U-C-H-E-T, Bouchet, sometimes they pronounce it over there. In Brittany, they pronounce all the little consonants even. And this is where I spent the next 6 years of my life, from 1 to almost 7. And all I remember of the war was that particular place, St Vincent and living with these people and all the things that happened during that time.
Who was with you, with the Bouchets?
Besides the Bouchet, there was their sons. They had 2 sons, whom I didn't really see on a regular basis, but I know they were there. They were older. They were not much older than we were. They were not kids. They were either older teenagers or adult. I don't know, one of them was an adult. There was also, on a more or less permanent basis, there was my brother, my sister Henriette, my brother Willie. All 3 of us stayed practically the whole war. I know I stayed the whole war over there. There was also my brother Charles, my older brother, and occasionally in and out, my other brothers and sisters. I didn't really realize why we were not all together in one place, but until much later, when I found out that my father had wanted everybody back in Paris. He still wanted to stay in Paris. It was kind of foolhardy, of course, for him, but he did want to go back to Paris and work. That was the reason.
What happened to your father and his 2 daughters?
Well, what happened is, because they went back to Paris, first of all, I have to say that immediately after we were taken in by Monsieur and Madame Bouchet, the first laws were passed. I'm not sure at that time that Monsieur and Madame Bouchet knew how much of a serious risk they were taking in sheltering us, but very shortly they found out. Well, the first laws were passed in late 1940. I'm talking about laws that restricted Jewish life every possible way. And one of them was that every able-bodied Jew was to perform forced labor. And my father was conscripted into forced labor at that time. So was my older half-sister. They were in Paris, and sometimes they went to the work camps and all that. This would have been tolerable. In fact, I remember my mother saying that my father could have lived with that as long as he knew there was an out of that. But what happened is that things became harsher and harsher until in 1942, when they had the famous, or the infamous sweeps through Paris, where they took, the French police rounded up Jews. They had been in agreement with the Germans that if the French police did round up the Jews, that they were not going to be sent to concentration camps. At that time, they knew about them, but nobody else did. But instead, they would be sent back to the forced labor camps. My father, I don't think, believed any of that, or at least many people didn't believe any of that. But in any case, in I think it was July 1942, that was the infamous sweep, which they took thousands of Jews during the night and herded them into a
Sorry, take a tissue. It's fine, Serge. Just take your time.
Sorry.
It's hard. Take me some water.
Sorry, but I think about that. It really does something to me. Anyway, they were sorry. Or herded into a sports stadium, which was called the Vélodrome d'Hiver, which was a place where they had bicycle racing, indoor bicycle racing. My two sisters were caught in this sweep. And who knows what happened to them. All I can imagine is that, well, I know one thing. They were taken to Drancy, which was a so-called resettlement camp. There were supposedly people who had been naturalized. They were not born in France. They were not born in France. My two sisters and my father and mother were not born in France. They were taken there to be supposedly resettled back into Eastern Europe, in other words, back where they came from. their case to Poland. Of course, nobody knew at that time that Drancy was just the first and last stop to Auschwitz. That was basically what happened. In the case of my two sisters, they spent probably a week in that indoor stadium, and after that, they just were taken to Auschwitz, cattle train. In fact, I have documentation on that. A book by Serge Patentreger, France, actually details all of the trips that were made and absolutely amazing detail. Incredible detail, because the Germans and the French police kept track of such things with amazing precision, amazing thoroughness. I mean, their names are in there, where they were born, what year they were born, where they were coming from, and of course the only thing that's not in there was where they were going. But that was, of course, found out after the war. They were all going to Auschwitz, right from Drancy, which was right outside of Paris. So they spent, I'm sure, 6 or 7 days on the train, because that was another thing that was horrible. It's a train ride from a place like this. They had to stop in places, stayed overnight, and I know that this is exactly the way that those train rides wound up. You didn't go straight, you just wound up with a whole night staying in one place and then went on, depending on the availability of the trains. What always bothers me about this is how my father must have felt about, and my mother, but certainly my father. His two daughters had disappeared. He had no idea what happened. In the meantime, he was in hiding because he himself was, of course, being sought. And we, relative safety in Brittany, but of course always subject to something like this. I think that 1942 marked a turning point for all of us in Paris and in Brittany. Because in 1942, all the laws and all the action came together. My father decided to go into hiding, and from that point on, he and my mother both, could not come out, could not do anything public, could not go to work, and so on and so forth. And also in Brittany, that's the time when we started really going into hiding. Up until that point, although certainly Monsieur and Madame Bouchet knew they were Jewish, I'm sure they had not realized the seriousness of, well, maybe they had realized, but certainly there was no grave consequences yet. But from 42 on, it was obvious that anybody who harbored Jews was going to be shot. No question about it. And it was just a matter of finding out.
At this time, could your mother still make trips back to see you?
Yes, and she did. As a matter of fact, I remember one particular trip. I remember several trips, but one in particular, because from that point on, as I said before, she was being sought. And she made one trip that I will always remember. It must have been, I remember things when I was probably 3 or 4 years old. I'm amazed I can remember them. Can't remember names from 10 minutes ago, but I do remember things from 40 years ago or 50 years ago. Some German soldiers came to our house, and I know that, well, I have to tell you that we'd been told, I have to go over what we'd been told and what we'd been brainwashed to do, but just for the moment, it's sufficient to say that they came to the house looking for my mother. I'm certain of that. My mother was hiding under a bed at that time. The German soldiers, along with a French policeman, came into the house. One of them, I remember, patted my head, and asked who I was. And Monsieur Bouchet said I was his son, even though he was totally dark-haired and I was totally blonde. But I guess they bought that. At least they didn't. They were not looking for anybody else. Remember, they were looking for people, for Jews who were not born in France at first. That was really the big thing. But later on, of course, it turned, as I said, 1942 was a turning point. So they went looking for my mother. They didn't find her. She was under a bed. And when they went out, when they left, we found out she had fainted under the bed and was, I'm sure that was petrified and absolutely traumatized. She still talked about that well after the war. That one incident when she almost got caught. In the meantime, my father was doing the same thing in Paris, of course. And wasn't really in hiding. We were in hiding in a sense. This is when we finally really went into hiding, as I said before. And this is when I became, in effect, a good little Christian. And from that point on, I was Christian. I went to church every, well, I'm not sure how often I went, but I know I went to church. And I was told by Monsieur and Madame Bouchet that whenever somebody asked anything of me, I would say, I go to church there. So that it would automatically give the idea that, first of all, I was their son, and secondly, that I couldn't possibly be Jewish. You know, that you have to. That was the way out. I'll just say the word. So I never. We never talked about being Jewish. Never. In fact, that's one thing I remember very well. And I think to this day, even to this day, I have a great deal of difficulty in talking about that. Great deal of difficulty. My wife always tells me that I don't talk about things like that because I can't. It's just been ingrained in me to the extent that even today, under absolutely non-threatening situations, I still don't talk about it. It just doesn't. That's why I admire people who are more than willing to talk about their Jewishness and are able to feel like they're free to be Jewish, no problem. They were born here, let's say, and never had any problems, or never experienced the trauma of having to hide. Right? Whereas for me, it was just and my brothers and sisters, all of them the same way. That they never really talked about it openly, or except among ourselves. Then we feel safe when you talk about it, and no real problem. But as soon as you get into other people, I think the first thing you do is hide the fact that you're Jewish. That's the first automatic reaction. Just hide it. After that, if somebody asks you leading questions or anything like that, you give evasive answers, or you lie. That's essentially what it is. I've done that. I know that many times over my life. Even today, I can lie very easily about something like that because it means survival. It meant survival, and today it's in my brain. I can't get out of it. So we went to church and we behaved just like, I've said many times that Monsieur and Madame Bouchet deserve at least a medal for heroism, for having sheltered us, knowing full well that we were Jewish, and knowing what the consequences would be, especially later, 42, 43, 44. They knew what the consequences were. They were going to be shot. That was that. And we were never discovered, at least we, in St Vincent, and nobody ever gave us any trouble over there. Monsieur and Madame Bouchet were not only extremely brave, but absolutely wonderful towards us. Even though they didn't have the resources, they really didn't have very much. We lived on a farm over there. I remember the farm had pigs, and it had the rest of the stuff that we ate, which was mostly, I always forget the name of the pumpkins. We ate mostly pumpkins and onions and pork. Those were the three main things we ate all throughout the war. It was rationed, so we had very, very little, very few resources, but we did manage to survive, and we lived under very, very primitive conditions. I remember myself and my brother and sister slept on one bed next to the pigsty. I mean, that was our bedroom. But of course, Monsieur and Madame Bouchet did not have any better conditions than we did, so they were really tremendously wonderful, not only heroic in my eyes, but also wonderful the way they treated us. Not that they were angels by any means. I remember very, very well the many times that they got drunk and really fought each other. Well, what they would do is, I'm sure one day a week, they would get totally drunk, run after each other around the table while all of us were petrified of them, and because they were acting like this and fighting and yelling at each other. But they never touched us, never. The next morning it was as if nothing had happened. So our life with them was certainly a lot safer. But I knew, though, this was not my family. I knew that my mother, whenever she was coming back to St Vincent, was always hiding, always you could sense the nervousness on it. And of course, I never saw my father. I never saw my other brothers and sisters. I always wondered what happened to everybody. Because I was told I had many other brothers and sisters, but I never saw them. They were all either in Paris or in between. Anyway, I said my two half-sisters, Rose and Anne, were taken. My father went into hiding, my mother went into hiding. And then by 1943, I think he probably felt a little bit safer, because after all, you have to go on living in spite of horrors around you. You do have to go on living, especially in his case. He felt that he had to make a living, he had to do something for his children, and it's only natural that you hope that things are going to improve at least a little bit, even during wartime conditions. And even in war, things can return to normal pretty quickly or pretty easily. I mean, war is not a constant state of battles. It's a lot of in-between. So this was the in-between period, 1942, 1943. And I think my father probably felt relatively safe, but there were still terrible things going on around us. But he didn't seem to worry as much as he did before, especially after his daughters went. I think he probably figured that when you have something horrible like that happen, I think you tend to become a little braver yourself. Anyway, he was staying in Paris, same apartment we had, and one day he was denounced by one of the local, the postman, mail carrier from the neighborhood. In those days, there were huge rewards for denouncing Jews. All you had to do is say you knew somebody, and if it was confirmed, and they found him and found her and arrested him, and he got a reward. So a lot of French people did denounce a lot of Jews. And my father was taken in April 1943, also to Drancy, the same situation. The difference there was that even with my two sisters, they'd been taken with nobody around. It was at night, and my brother, everybody else was out of the house. They were taken. There was nobody else to take. In the case of my father, my older brother was there in the house. They didn't take him, because all they were looking for again were Jews who were not born in France. They took my father right in front of my brother, who must have, I know he still talks about this like it was a big trauma of his life, and I'm sure it was, because it must have been horrible to see his father just disappear like that in one instant. And they took him, and of course we never saw him again. He was taken to, we know now that he was taken to Drancy, also the resettlement camp, but he didn't spend as much time as my two half-sisters, because he went straight to Auschwitz. In other words, he went to Drancy, next day, 2 days later. In those days, in 1943, they were not messing around anymore. It was right to Auschwitz. And we know that because of the documentation where his freight train and all that was sent, what date, and so on.
Where was your mother at the time?
My mother was in St Vincent at that time when he was taken. I think that whoever denounced my father must have thought they were going to catch everybody at the same time. But I think they must have had also this almost self-protection system where each one told the other. They were never together for very long, because they were always either going to St Vincent or working or whatever. They were never staying too long in one place or at the same time. The both of them together. So I think my mother, in effect, who probably knew, and she had told my father many, many times, apparently, to come with us to St Vincent, but would have been much too difficult, and I'm not sure why. But I'm still not sure why my father refused to come. I don't know. I have a feeling that after having lost his two daughters, he probably felt that everything was lost anyway. I don't know. I really have no way of knowing why he would have stayed in Paris after this. But my mother was more of a, I think my mother was more of a survivor than he was. I think he had probably not given up. But I mean, it's the idea that he probably felt that things were not going to get any better. Was my mother was a survivor, and she came back again and again to St Vincent. I don't know how she did it. I really don't know, because during the war you had many, many restrictions. You couldn't just travel freely, and first of all, you had no money, and on top of that, to travel like this was extremely dangerous. But she did it several times. I know we saw her a few times in St Vincent.
What happened to your brother when your father was taken?
My brother was actually taken in by neighbors, by friends of the family. I think not taken, he went with the friends because he knew that it had been talked about that if anybody was taken, that they would go to the family, that the friends were. This particular case was an old lady, Madame Kouflig, who was living above us, was also Jewish, by the way, but she was born over there, and that was always the arrangement, that if anything happened, that she would go to, that he or anybody else would go over there. Or we had also some friends in another part of Paris who would have taken us in. So that was I guess the way they were going to protect themselves. Yeah.
And then did your brother stay there until the end of the war?
I don't really know how long he stayed there. All I know is that I saw him a couple of times in St Vincent. He did come to live with us for a while, because I remember him on a couple of occasions. In fact, we had a famous incident, not famous, but a rather amusing incident, where, I told you before, everything was rationed during the war. And my brother had decided that he was going to he and I were going to eat a little more sugar than what we were supposed to, and there was very, very little sugar. And he claims, by the way, now that was jam. I still say it was sugar. Anyway, there was something, everything was rations. It didn't matter what you ate. You couldn't eat much of it. And what he did was to eat more than his share of whatever it was, the jam or the sugar, I'm not sure. But he gave it to me, or at least most of it to me. But when Monsieur Bouchet got back and learned about the sugar missing, so I guess one time when he got mad and beat him up, I escaped. I was the little pet, I think, in those days. I was always sickly, and people just gave me, and my brothers, sisters, Monsieur and Madame Bouchet always gave me the extra serving, at least at that time.
Do you remember talking to any of the neighbors?
You mean in St Vincent-les-Landes? All I know, I don't remember really any neighbors. All I know is going to school and going to church. Those were the two things that I remember the most about St Vincent-les-Landes. And of course, living with Monsieur and Madame Bouchet. We really, you gotta remember, it was a small village. I mean, there was not too many people around. These were farms. And in fact, the less you talked to anybody, the better it was, better off you were. I've since revisited St Vincent-les-Landes. In fact, I visited last year with my wife, and we talked to a few people and we asked them, because Monsieur and Madame Bouchet have long since died, we asked some people who lived there during that time, they know that all the people that were, because many people were sheltered in St Vincent-les-Landes, as we found out later. Did they know that they were Jewish? Or how did they know that they were Jewish? And they told us that if they came from Paris, they were Jewish. In other words, nobody, as I said before, nobody but Jews had no place to go. If they came to St Vincent-les-Landes, they knew they were Jewish. So everybody knew in the village that they were sheltering Jews, but nobody ever said anything. So I guess that was the heroism, not just on the part of Monsieur and Madame Bouchet, but many others as well.
Can you describe what it was like to go to school there?
Well, all I remember is it was a very, very primitive school, a village school. where everybody was thrown together. Also, it was during the war, so very few resources of any kind. I do remember the, we call it the wood stove in the middle of the room there. And our teachers being extremely strict, that I do remember. Of course, that was true all over France, so I guess it was not exactly an exception. But one of the things, again, that we were told is that even in school, we're not to say anything to anybody. So the experience in school was practically like we had everywhere else. We're not to talk to anybody about anything about our background. Then in my case, I was so young, I probably don't remember my background in any case. In the case of my older brother and sister, they could have spilled the beans and said a few things that possibly could have been told to other people.
Your older brother and sister, did they talk to you about being Jewish in private?
I don't ever remember anybody talking, even at the home of Monsieur and Bouchet, that we ever talked about that, ever, because that was one of the no-nos. I said before, the only time I remember, the only time I've talked to anybody else about being Jewish and talking about things like that was much later. Never talked during the war, never. I don't remember ever doing that. In fact, I have to say this, I thought I was Catholic for the longest time, although I knew I was different because we were coming from somewhere else. That's all. I knew it was not of this village because everybody told me that. But I also didn't think that was anything but Catholic. We happened to have come from somewhere else. So it wasn't until 1945, 46, that I found out. That was confirmed to me. I never even thought about it. It's not like you were saying consciously, am I or am I not? Just don't think about it.
Who told you?
I think at that time it must have been when I went into the children's home. Because after the war, I spent the next 11 years in children's homes, from 45, 46 to 56 in children's homes. My father was dead. My two half-sisters were dead. And my mother still had 7 children. And we had to disband for financial reasons and other reasons. In my case, was health reasons as well. We were all sent to children's homes except for my older sister and my older brother. And as I said, I spent the next 11 years like orphanages, because after the war they considered anybody who had had their father or mother taken to be an orphan. So we were considered wards of the nation. So that's when I found out. The very first home that I went into, Cailly in Normandy, not too far from where St Vincent was a Jewish children's home. And I found out for the first time that and we didn't go to church, so I knew it was something different. In fact, this was the first time I'd seen Sabbath celebrated. That was in 1946, 47, or something like that. And I knew then that my days as a Catholic were over.
To backtrack a minute, can you describe when someone told you that the war was over? Do you remember any
Yes,
of that?
I remember. I really do remember the end of the war. At that time, I was 6 years old. I have to tell you what happened before the end of the war, because it was really an amazing difference. In other words, during the war, there was very little happening in the village. But around the end of the war, except for the comings and goings of my mother and brothers and sisters, we had a halfway normal life. I shouldn't say it was a normal and good life. I still think I'm suffering from the effects of that period of my life, point of the physical and other points of view. But at least we were safe for the moment. But back in, I think it started 1943, late 43 or early 44, I don't really know exactly when, we started seeing some tremendous military activity, particularly planes coming over Brittany, over our place. At that time, of course, I had no idea what was going on, but I remember very, very vividly all the planes massing in the sky. It was like black with planes. Of course, it might have been my children's imagination to play tricks with me, but I know there were many, many planes, and I mean day and night coming in, bombing what they were trying to do, of course, was soften up the German positions in Brittany and Normandy. But we saw them, and several bombs came right near us. We saw several buildings destroyed, and a bomb actually fell in a field next to us. I remember because we all ran to see what it was. It was red. It was coming down. I remember there's a red object coming down. It was on fire, or something was on fire. It was red, absolutely. And then I saw it was a plane that came down as well. It wasn't just a bomb. The plane came down and crashed. And that was, of course, an amazing event for us, because really, up until that point, we had not experienced the war. We really had not. It's strangely ironic that it's only at the end of the war that we experienced the war. And we were bombed day and night. And I remember the problems with our room. We had shoes lining up all the shelves, and every time the bombs came, all the shoes fell down. So we knew when there was an air raid or something like that, but just by all the objects in the house coming down. But the end of the war I remember well, because there were many things that happened. For one thing, the Americans came. I mean, what I remember of the end of the war was the bombing, and then the Americans coming probably late 44, I have to guess. At that time I was 5.5 years old. And immediately they gave us, I remember very well how they gave us chocolate, chewing gum. First time I had seen chocolate, first time I had seen chewing gum, first time I had seen an orange. I remember that very well. They gave us all these things, and we considered Americans to be absolutely heroes from somewhere. We didn't know where they were coming from, but they were heroes to us. And I also remember that there were many American soldiers that were, I guess it was an entire company that was of tanks and armored carriers that was lined up along the ditch. And the next day, and they slept, the soldiers actually slept under the half tracks, under the armored carriers. There was no place else to them. And I remember one particular time when the next day they found 2 or 3 American soldiers crushed by their own armored carrier, which had moved right into the ditch with them. So they were killed right in there. The other thing I remember about the end of the war was the tremendous bonfires. There were bonfires everywhere. But I don't know if they have anything comparable here as far as bonfires, but those huge straw things, and they were burning Hitler in effigy, burning Mussolini in effigy. I mean, huge things that made of straw and wood and all that. And we all danced around them and all that. That was the happy part. The other part I remember is, and I'm not sure where it was in the village of St Vincent, or they took us to Chateaubriant, which was the town where we had stopped. But they were people who had collaborated with the Germans, who were caught, certainly not tried, I'm sure, but shot in public squares because they wanted to set an example and also revenge from people who had suffered for 5-6 years. But I do remember because they made us come to the executions. Not that it was not for our pleasure. Certainly, it was not. It was more for to gather all the people and say, "Right there's what happens to collaborators," and they were shot against the walls. So
Who
I do
shot
remember
them?
that. Usually the French resistance, but they're the ones arresting them. The army still had not come in. The French army, the French police had not been organized. You got to remember, practically all the French police were collaborators with the Germans, at least in that region. I guess I should have said that France was really divided into 2 parts in World War II. The occupied zone, which was really totally under German control, even though they let the French do the dirty work. And there was the southern, the free so-called zone, at least for a while, where Maréchal Pétain was in charge, an old warrior from World War I, was a hero during World War I, and of course considered by many to be a traitor during World War II. Anyway, he was in charge of the southern zone, until probably the late 1943 when the Germans decided they'd had enough of him as well. They occupied all of France. So all the laws that applied to Jews that were strictly for northern France became applicable. You couldn't escape anywhere. That was the other thing that created tremendous problems, because up until 1943, 44, you could at least escape into the Italian zone, which was the Riviera. The Italians had occupied the Riviera. Nice place to occupy. But people knew they could escape there and be at least safe for a while. The Italians never did what the Germans did and the French police did in the rest of France. Yeah.
So when you witnessed these executions, did you talk to your brothers and sister?
I don't remember even being with my brothers and sisters. I think it was Monsieur and Madame Bouchet who took me there with probably some friends. I also remember, I mean, the executions were not something that all that common or anything. I don't want to give the impression it was, but it certainly was left a more lasting impression in my mind because of the, all of a sudden see them dead there. But I think they took me everywhere. I remember them taking me to somebody's house who was dying, or who was dead, I'm not sure which. I guess they wanted me to be there during, that's a French tradition, watch the dead there for a while, it's a vigil or whatever. And I do remember that, so I don't think they would have had any hesitation in taking me to somewhere, especially since they realized that what they had done during the war, what these people had done during the war, which was just the opposite, of course. This went on, by the way, throughout France. This was certainly not an isolated incident in St Vincent or Chateaubriant. It was all over France.
When did you see your mother again?
I saw my mother at the end of the war. As a matter of fact, I still have pictures because in 1945 she came to St Vincent to pick us up and take me to Cailly. I do have pictures of her, so I know that she was there. And she looked rather serious and worried at that time. Because I think what you have to realize is that even though the war was a tremendously traumatic experience, whether my mother, my father, my two sisters, my mother, actually what the effects for me is more after the war, much more after the war as a result of the war. The fact that my father had died, the fact that my two sisters had died, the fact that we had our lives completely disrupted, dislocated, and in many ways changed forever. I mean, we couldn't go back to what it was before. I don't think my mother ever recovered. She died in 1965 of cancer, but I know she was always a very, very high-strung woman. She never recovered from the experience of World War II. Neither did really my sisters and brothers. I'm sure neither did I. I know I'm still a product of what happened then. In other words, the physical effects. I know that during the war, contracted rickets, which was vitamin D deficiency. Normally doesn't cause much of a problem because of the, I mean, if you had normal conditions, you could take vitamin D supplements, whatever. In my case, it caused all sorts of deformation of the bones and all that. And then I was subject to all sorts of infections. I did get an infection, I think it was when I was 8 or 9 years old. I became deaf in my left ear, actually. All these things I know I can almost blame on World War II because of all the conditions that were prevalent then. So I see myself as a continuing victim of the war, continuing victim, not so much because of what happened during the war. To me personally, although many things did happen, but as a result of all the conditions that were the results of the war.
During the 11 years you were in and out of homes, where were your other brothers and sisters?
Well, some of them were with me in homes, in the same homes, matter of fact. In Cailly, for example, my older brother was with me. I moved very rapidly from one home to another. It was very difficult for me to figure out where my brothers and sisters were. I moved to, I can give you a succession because I still remember them as if it were yesterday. Cailly was in Normandy. I moved to Cessieux in the Alps, French Alps, in 1947 to 1948. So I'd been in Cailly from 46 to 47. and 47, 48 in Cessieux. Then, for some reason, I moved back to Paris. I never had any idea why or what the situation was. 1948, in early 49, came back to Paris. This is the only time I remember living with my mother, the first 6 months of 1949. The happiest time in my life, probably, at least in France, where I lived for 6 months over there. Now, for whatever reason, I went back to another children's home, WWII, which was probably the best of all the children's homes, because it was not so much like an orphanage as the others. And then, even while in WWII, I went to several others. WWII was right near Paris, by the way, which was a very nice and convenient location compared to the others. But I went down also several years later, 1954, to Pau, which is near Lourdes, the site of the miracles. I spent probably a miserable year over there. Spent another miserable year in Bourges, which is the center of France, and so on. So I spent many unhappy times everywhere. But I can understand now why all this was happening, although at that time, of course, I was terribly, terribly unhappy and depressed. But I knew everybody was telling us, because of the war, you're orphans. At that time, I really thought I was an orphan, actually.
Did you have a sense of being Jewish during these years?
Yes, definitely. It became more and more, I became more and more aware of it, particularly in WWII. Although WWII was not a home for, it was definitely a home mostly for Jewish children. It was not a home where religion was prevalent, but still what they did was to instill in us all sorts of, we learned Jewish history, Jewish values. I learned Hebrew. I learned all the holidays without any religiousness being built into it. So that's where I really discovered being Jewish, about being Jewish.
Serge, before we continue, what were the first names of the two sons and Mr. and Mrs. Bouchet, if you remember?
Well, I have to tell you, I don't remember anyone's name except from Madame Bouchet. Her name was Germaine. I do remember that. We used to call them always Monsieur Bouchet, Madame Bouchet. Never had any other name for them. Their two sons I really didn't know all that well. And one of them, I believe, was married. The other one was in and out, working or whatever. Really never dealt with them very much. The only way I even found out what Madame Bouchet's first name was, that last year when I revisited St Vincent, we talked to her daughter-in-law, who was still living there. In fact, she only lives like half a mile from the farm where we were at. And she told us that her mother-in-law's name was Germaine, and also that her husband, their youngest son, had died. No, we didn't find out from them, from her. We found out from a neighbor that her husband had died 5 years earlier. So I never met the younger son again. It's really too bad. I feel very bad about that. We could not have at least talked to somebody who was a direct witness to our stay over there. We did talk to quite a few people over there in St Vincent who had known the Bouchet, including the daughter-in-law, of course, and the neighbor. One of the neighbors was an 80-year-old gentleman who was more than willing to share with us memories of the war. And we also talked to people who now live on the farm, which has been renovated. In fact, not only the farm, but the whole town looks more like a yuppie tourist town than anything that I remember about it, except for the church. The church still looks the same as it was. The school where I went to has disappeared. It got destroyed or whatever. But the people at we went to visit at the farm, young couple in their 30s, I guess, 40s, and their father greeted us and asked us to come in and made us feel very, very welcome. We told them what the situation was. I told them I wanted to see the inside of the house. I had not seen it in 45 years. I really wanted to see where I'd spent 6 years of my life. And he told us, especially the old man who was 81 years old, I believe, told us that, yes, he did remember, in fact, when this was, because everybody in St Vincent knows everybody. He told us when this place was a pigsty where we lived, so he confirmed everything that I remembered about the farm and about the conditions. I also told him I remembered crossing fields to get to school over there. He said, oh yeah, you must have gone to this school because it's the closest one, and of course it's no longer in existence, but I'm sure you must have gone to that school. And he showed us the field I must have crossed to get to school. So it was a very moving experience to at least see where we were living for 6 years. I was living for 6 years.
Why do you think the Bouchets hid you?
Well, this is still a tremendous puzzle, mystery to me. As I said before, I'm amazed at their bravery and their compassion. Not just bravery, but the fact that you have to be compassionate. You can be brave and without any compassion won't make much of a difference. I have to say that as far as I know, they never got any monetary reward for it. They never got anything that I know of that would have given them an incentive to shelter us. I mean, after all, we went there in 1940. When things settled down, they could have said, okay, goodbye now. You know, we have to go back to our normal lives. But they agreed to keep us, at least myself, and probably one or two of my brothers and sisters at any one time. There were always 2 or 3 of us over there, under conditions that were not very good, of course. So the only thing I can think about them is that they were heroic in the sense of just doing what seemed to be right to them. That's the only thing I can think of, because there was no real other motivation to do it. And they were very, they lived very simply. There were certainly no intellectuals who could rationalize these things. They were not even religious. That's one thing I remember. They took us to church, but that was mostly for what I said was an elaborate way to hide us. The 2 sons were just as good as they were towards us, and also didn't get any reward out of it. Even after the war, they didn't get anything out of it. So I'm not sure what it is, except for a sense of compassion and just plain heroism, bravery. And nothing else that can possibly explain their action. They knew every day from late 1942 on that they were in danger. No question about that. And I found out later, last year, well, several other families who harbored Jews in the region were also in grave danger and did the same thing. So it does make you wonder what motivates people like that. As I said, again, they were not especially religious, not especially angels. They were not particularly intellectual people who could have rationalized all this in terms of ethics and duty versus all that good stuff. They were just people who did it because they felt it was a compassionate thing to do, I'm sure.
Will you now talk a little bit about your mother?
I'd like to, because I think that my mother is the real hero of the whole story. I mean, in terms of what happened to her and how she saved us. My older sister always says that my mother gave us life twice. She gave us life to begin with, and she saved us during the war. So she gave us a second life, a second chance. My mother was a very, I said before, a resourceful woman who managed under terrible conditions. But she knew she knew that was the only way to survive. I think reason I want to talk about my mother, not because it's easy. It's tough for a few minutes.
Serge, we can't stop the tape, but we can.
Right.
Why don't you tell us what happened and how you all came to the United States?
Okay. Well, as I said, my mother was extremely resourceful, managed extremely well. I'm sure we survived because of her, because of all the things she did for us. I think she really gave her life for us, even though she didn't die herself during the war. I think to survive without my father and no parent resources, she managed admirably well. I have to say that I only recognize this now. I didn't realize how courageous she was back then, how resourceful. As far as coming to the United States, she decided, and I know it happened right after World War II, at the very end of World War II, our meeting with the American soldiers was really what triggered her desire to have us come to America. In fact, we met right there on St Vincent Land, an American soldier. I forget his name now. I remembered it up until a few years ago. It escapes me now. Maybe I'll remember it later. This was also a brave person who talked to my mother about World War II. I guess he took a great deal of interest in us. He knew what our situation was. Was not Jewish. In fact, it was Italian-American from New York City who just felt a great deal of sympathy towards us. So he told my mother about, I know because I was there, I remember all the conversations about America, where he told us how wonderful things could be, all that. Now, of course, you have to remember our condition. Having lived through years of rationing and lack of freedom, and all that, when you hear something like that, it does impress you greatly. My mother, of course, was also impressed with the fact that she could rebuild her life over there. I mean, everybody at the end of the war talked about rebuilding, you know, even though you had suffered tremendous tragedy, you had to go on, and she felt that she could make a new start. The problem, though, is that it didn't happen that simply. Obviously, you don't just come out and say, I meet an American soldier, let him sponsor me, and I become eligible to go to America. It didn't happen that easily and not that simply. As I said, we were sent to children's homes all over the place. My mother never lost the drive or the dream to come to America. And what she did finally achieve was for my sister Jacqueline to come here. And she arrived in the United States in late 48, winter of 48, I believe. She was the first one, and she was sponsored by not only the American soldier, but also by a relative who had come to America back in the 20s, 30s. She was actually an aunt of my mother. So Jacqueline came over to the United States, and then in very quick succession after that, 1954, my brother Henry also emigrated. In 1955, my sister Adela, they were twins, emigrated. In 1956, we did, my mother, my brother Willie, and myself. So 11 years after the war, all the ones who were eventually going to come to America did come to America. But I would say it had to be as a result of this, I guess, the conversation that she had with the American soldier and the idea that she wanted to build a new life. In the meantime, my mother had remarried. 1947, 48, I believe, she did remarry. And well, she married a man who was also has an incredible story. I mean, that in itself would fill a novel. My stepfather was a man who had studied, if I may talk about him, because he was such an interesting man. His stories was like this. He was born in Poland also, of a relatively well-off family. He was well-off, actually. He was studying to be a doctor. And just before World War II, in 1939, he was going to graduate. And instead, Poland was invaded, and he was drafted into the Polish army and got caught. It was like hundreds of thousands of other soldiers over there, and became a prisoner of war for 5 years. His life was, just like ours, was shattered forever. He was also Jewish. His life was shattered forever. He spent 5 years in a prisoner of war camp in Italy, of all places. I'm not sure why, but I guess Italy was the ally of Germany. He never realized his dream of becoming a doctor, because after the war, everything was absolutely, totally different. He'd become I think, a broken man, physically, emotionally, nervous. He had all sorts of nervous habits. I remember he had a violent temper. There was an occasion it would just flare up and become all that, of course, I'm sure the direct result of what happened to him during the war. And they had a daughter, Elizabeth, my half-sister. What I was going to say about him is that I think that my mother fell into the same, not that fell into the same pattern, because obviously there was no pattern before that, but I think she was herself a victim of the war. She married somebody who was a victim of the war. I mean, in those days, it was so easy to associate yourself with somebody who was also the same situation as you were, and you fall into that situation. Well, it was not very good for my mother or the family, because he never, after the war, he never held a steady job, never had any, I mean, even though he had the will, he was never able to recover from 5 years of the prisoner of war camp. And my mother by then had decided, I guess, that one way or another, we're all going to go to America, whether he came with us or not. That was the other real tragedy. What happened is that he was left behind, along with my half-sister, Elizabeth, whom my mother had sent to a nurse, in fact, a nourrice in French, which means somebody who takes care of you for good. I mean, it's not like you're sending him as a babysitting exercise. They take care of you forever. And that's where my sister Elizabeth spent her first 18 years, that woman. In the meantime, we came to the United States in 1956, and I never saw my stepfather after that.
Looking back now over your life and your family, are there messages you'd like to leave your children or your grandchildren?
Probably my grandchildren as well.
Soon to be.
Right. Well, there's well, first of all, there's definitely a message of hope and a message of optimism. Even though I've had all these experiences, believe me, if anybody who knows me knows that I'm not like that all the time, that's for sure. In other words, I'm always relatively, have a pretty good sense of humor, and so one of the messages that I have is that in spite of everything, you can survive. I mean, you can really survive all sorts of things, and even though it's traumatic, and occasionally when you relive them, it's difficult, you can survive. It's not impossible in spite of all the evils that are done to you. So that's one message. Secondly, the other message I have, I think it's more of my personal philosophy than a message. That is, you always have to manage with as little as possible in life, because you never know when you're going to have nothing. In other words, I've always said to many people, I can be ready anytime to go down to nothing, and I would manage, because I'm not spoiled. In other words, I know what I can manage with at a certain, up to a certain level. Obviously, subsistence has to be there. Actually, that's one of the things that sort of has struck me all the years I've lived in the United States, that most people in the United States who were born here, lived here, have not known what it's like to have nothing or to have everything taken away from you. So therefore, it's very easy to fall into a complacent attitude and to be spoiled. That's basically the word I have. See, when I look at the situation, for example, in Bosnia and elsewhere, you can relive almost what has happened to you, except that now it's distant. But I can understand now. I can understand now why people during World War II did not do that much. Even though in those days there were other problems. Communications was certainly one of them. Today we have communication. You get from one minute to the next, you know what's happening in Sarajevo. Those days, it was impossible to know. I'm sure people in the United States and elsewhere didn't know what was happening, particularly in Europe, because there was a blackout and so on. But I think the idea is to, if you know something, to at least feel something, to express it. But I can understand why, looking at what the Europeans are not doing to save, let's say, the people in Sarajevo, why we would have been left alone. Very easy to see. So those are the messages I'm leaving, the sense of survival, they can survive, a sense of, there's certainly a pride in having survived, knowing that you've gone through a whole lot and still managed fairly well. I have a nice family, nice life now. It's almost you almost feel guilty about having that, of course, especially since my mother never had that. That's the other thing that has always bothered me. But at least you know that you've accomplished something, and you have survived, and you're here to at least tell your story. And the other one is one of look out, watch out, because things are always happening around you that may happen again. I think I've told you that I always look at people, everybody around me, as if I can, I always try to imagine what it would be like under similar conditions as I went through during World War II. And I don't mean how would they survive what I've gone through. That's not what I mean. What I mean is what would their role be, considering what I have seen in terms of people being heroic, people being cowards, or giving in to greed or whatever other motivation. In other words, the people who turned my father in obviously were victims of their greed. The people who didn't do anything were victims of cowardice or indifference, which is probably worse. The people who were like the Bouchet and others were heroes and brave and deserve everything. But I always wonder, I always look at people. I cannot help that. Look at people in terms of what would they be if they were put under similar similar circumstances. And my theory, which is a theory that's been widely studied and accepted, is that there's always that 5% people who are activists, who would be heroes, 5% who are totally the other way. In other words, they'd be against you, be the Nazis, let's say, of the world, if you will. They don't have to be Nazis, it can be anything. And the 90% between indifferent or unwilling to do anything about what they see around them. Injustice and wrongs, and also physical, emotional brutality. So that's how I look at people, even at work. I remember one time when I had, that was a long time ago, I almost classified people into two categories. People who would be helpful, or at least would be sort of neutral, hopefully, and others who would probably do me, or do us, anybody, wrong, because that's the way their character was. And I'm convinced of that. That is exactly, it doesn't matter whether they were Germans or French or Hungarians or Americans. It could happen anywhere. It just depends on the personalities of the people. And if they're willing to let something happen without doing anything. I'm not sure, by the way, that I would be as courageous as the Bouchets. In fact, I wonder what I would have done. I will always wonder, because I probably will never be in that situation. But I certainly know that a lot of people would shy away from that kind of thing and would take the easy way out.
In the little time that's remaining, is there anything else you'd like to tell us?
Well, first of all, I'd like to give another message to my children particularly. That is to learn a lot more about their own family's situation, get so immediately connected to them, particularly as it relates to our World War II experience and our, not just the World War II experience, but our family life. It's a very important, it's now that I see it more than ever, the connection between generations, to try to carry on. So to learn more about your past, learn more about your background, and to be more aware of what it means to you in terms of pride and enjoyment, I guess. As far as you were asking me about other incidents or other the other incidents I remember have to do with, and this is after the war, because during the war, as I said, we lived practically as Catholics. But after the war, and it confirms what I said just a few minutes ago, that things can go back to normal almost immediately after all the horrors have abated. After the war, I remember rampant anti-Semitism in France, even though things had already happened that would think they would have opened their eyes for 1,000 years. Didn't take long at all. I was living in, as I said, in Jewish homes mostly, and we were the targets of, not attacks or anything, just a kind of insidious anti-Semitism that you find that really makes you want to rebel. And that's another reason, by the way. I'm sure that I've always tried to keep a low profile on this. I was told that during the war, what saved us is that we didn't look like Jews at all. We were little Aryans there. And therefore, that's the way to save yourself. You look like Aryans, you act like Aryans, you don't talk about being Jewish, therefore you will be okay. But being in Jewish homes, of course, we're immediately identified, and they knew that's what we were. So when we went to school or went into the village or whatever, always the targets of, not, as I said, not attacks, nothing open, nothing openly hostile, but just a feeling and words being said.
We will end the interview soon, but before we do, what was the title of this Serge Klarsfeld book?
That was I don't remember the exact title, but it had to do with the story of the deportation, déportation in French, of French Jews during World War II from 1940 to 1945. It was really not you couldn't call it a novel, or you couldn't call it even a document. It was just a compilation of all, and by name, by dates, by transport, of all the Jews in France who had been taken to concentration camps and who had died there, or in some cases survived by escaping the train. So it was really a memorial to some 80,000 Jews who died during World War II in concentration camps, and with their individual names, all the information about them listed.
Thank you very much for coming in this evening.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak about all this, even though it was not easy.
Thank you.
At least I think I needed this.